You probably wouldn't have noticed me back then. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't loud, but I was always there. While Martin was chasing promotions and polishing his image, I was the one picking up extra shifts, skipping meals, keeping the lights on. I walked to work when we couldn't afford gas. I made pasta stretch for 3 nights. I smiled through it all because I believed it would be worth it. Every time he came home with another rejection letter, I held him. I told him they just didn't see what I saw. Not yet. When he broke down, when his confidence cracked, I stitched it back together with every ounce of strength I had left. He wanted success. I just wanted to see him happy again. That was enough for me. There were nights I pretended I'd already eaten. I'd push the last bite onto his plate and say, I grabbed something at work, even if my stomach was aching. I became the fuel for both of us, emotionally, financially, physically. He was the dreamer. I was the one making sure he had the space to dream. Back then, we didn't have much, but we had each other. Or at least, that's what I thought. I remember lying awake, staring at the ceiling while he talked in his sleep about the future, the office with a view, the corner desk, the title on his email signature. I used to smile at that. I wanted it for him, maybe even more than he did. Because if he won, we won. That's how I saw it. But it wasn't easy. Not even close. Our car broke down more times than I can count. Rent was late, so often the landlord stopped calling. I sold my mom's jewelry once to cover a tuition payment for a course Martin swore would land him the job. He didn't even know I did that. I just told him we got lucky that month. That was my role, to make the impossible feel invisible. And when his friends laughed about our tiny apartment or asked why he was still with that girl from before, he always said I was just holding him back. Never to my face, of course, but I heard things, and I felt them. The shrinking conversations, the excuses. But I held on, thinking, once he gets there, everything will change. I just didn't realize it already had, and not in the way I hoped. The truth is, I never wanted applause. I didn't need credit. I just wanted to matter. I wanted to be the person he looked back at and said, I couldn't have done this without her. But as the years went on, it felt like the more I gave, the more invisible I became. He started talking about image and perception, like success was a show, and I wasn't part of the cast. Still, I cheered louder than anyone else when he finally got that call. The executive role he'd been chasing for years. It was his. And I meant it when I hugged him, when I said I was proud. Because despite everything, I believed in him. Not the version he crafted for the world, but the broken, anxious man I held through failure after failure. The one who used to cry in my arms when no one returned his calls. He didn't make it there alone. And deep down, I think he knows that. But it's funny, isn't it? I stood by him through every low, every overdraft notice, every broken promise. Yet somehow, the higher he rose, the harder it became for him to look down and see me. The night of the party, I was already dressed. Nothing fancy. Just a soft blue dress he once said made my eyes look like the ocean. I even curled my hair, which I rarely do. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, waiting for him to say, "Come on, let's go." But the only thing I got was a text. 4 sentences. Cold, calculated. I didn't want them to think I'm not on their level. Hope you understand. I read it again, and again. My chest tightened like something inside me snapped. I stared at those words until the screen dimmed. Not on their level? After everything? After years of sleeping on a sagging mattress, of praying the check wouldn't bounce, I wasn't good enough now? I tried to tell myself there must be a reason. That maybe he was nervous. That maybe someone told him no spouses allowed. But a reason never came. Just silence. And a clock that kept ticking. I sat there, fully dressed, watching the night pass without me, wondering how long he'd been planning to leave me out. And more importantly, what else he was leaving me out of. The next morning, I woke up with that same ache in my chest, the kind that doesn't go away with coffee or a hot shower. I told myself not to look. I really did. But curiosity has a cruel way of twisting the knife. I opened Instagram and searched the company's page, just to see. Just to prove to myself that maybe, somehow, I was overreacting. But there he was, post after post. In one, he was laughing under gold balloons, a champagne glass in his hand. In another, He stood center frame, arm wrapped around a woman I'd never seen before. Not a coworker, not a friend. She was stunning, polished. The kind of woman who probably didn't know what it's like to split dinner bills or cry over bounced rent. And the caption? Celebrating the man of the hour. It felt like someone reached through the screen and slapped me. My ears rang. My hands went cold. Because he didn't just forget to include me, he'd already replaced me. Rewritten the narrative without the woman who held the pen for all those struggling chapters. I stared at that photo for what felt like hours, not because of her, but because of him. That smile. That same crooked grin he used to flash when I'd surprise him with dinner after a long shift. Except now, it wasn't for me. And suddenly, everything made sense. The distance, the excuses, the way he started calling me too sensitive every time I asked a question. I thought the pain would come with rage, with shouting, with throwing something against a wall. But it didn't. It came quietly, like a wave pulling back just before it crashes. I sat in that silence, surrounded by all the versions of me that had waited, prayed, sacrificed, and I realized none of them would be invited to this new version of his life. So I wiped my tears, closed the app, and stood up. Because if he wanted to rewrite history, I wasn't going to beg for a footnote. No, I had given too much for too long to disappear now. I didn't scream. I didn't storm out. I didn't even ask him where he'd been. That night, when he walked through the door, I just smiled and said, "How was the party?" And he, bold as ever, kissed me on the cheek like nothing had changed. Maybe to him, nothing had. But inside me, something had snapped, quietly, cleanly, like a thread pulled from the hem of a dress, invisible at first, until the whole thing starts to unravel. That's when I knew. If I was going to do this, I had to be methodical, strategic. No dramatic fights, no burning bridges. I started gathering everything, old bank transfers showing how I paid for his certifications, emails where I revised his resumes, credit card statements with flights and fees tied to his job interviews. My name was behind more of his success than even he remembered, and then I started making calls. One to a lawyer, a woman with a steel voice and soft eyes who didn't ask why, just said, "Let's get to work." Another to a journalist I'd followed for years, a woman known for writing about the invisible labor women do in men's lives. I wasn't going to shout into the void. I was going to shine a light and aim it right at the cracks he'd tried to plaster over. The lawyer didn't flinch when I laid it all out. The years, the receipts, the late nights and lost dreams. She just nodded and said, "You've got more than most people walk in with." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at that. For so long, I thought I had nothing to show for all I gave. Turns out, I'd been documenting my own story without even knowing it. Every dollar, every favor, every forgotten birthday while he worked late chasing that dream. The journalist, her name was Marla, called me the next day. We talked for 3 hours. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush, just listened. Like really listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a second and then said, "This isn't just your story. It's every woman who's ever carried a man's future on her back." That's when I knew I wasn't just getting even. I was reclaiming every piece of myself I'd handed over, one compromise at a time. I started to sleep better after that. Not because things were fixed, far from it, but because for the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking to make someone else shine. I was making space, not for him, for me. For the version of me that stopped asking to be seen and started demanding it. I didn't tell a soul, not my friends, not even my sister. The quiet felt powerful now, like armor. Every morning, I'd pack his lunch like always, fold his shirts, kiss him goodbye. He had no idea that while he walked out the door, head high with pride, I was building the narrative that would dismantle the pedestal he'd put himself on. He thought silence meant submission, but mine was a strategy. I found photos buried deep in old files, me in the background of his graduation, me holding the camera at his first job interview. I wasn't in his story, but I was behind every frame. That realization hit harder than anything else. He hadn't just cut me out. He'd been doing it in slow motion for years. I just didn't see it. Or maybe I didn't want to. But I see it now, all of it. And I'm not crying anymore. I'm documenting, organizing, preparing. Because if Martin wanted to live like I never existed, I was going to make sure the world saw every inch of who I really was and what he owed to the woman he left in the shadows. I knew the article was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment it dropped. The headline alone took my breath. The wife behind the executive, the story he didn't want you to know. It wasn't just a piece, it was a spotlight. And suddenly, everything I'd carried in silence was out there, printed in bold, read by thousands. My name, my story, my truth. People flooded the comments, women saying, "This is my story too." Men apologizing to the partners they'd taken for granted. Strangers thanking me for speaking up. But the best part? The silence from Martin. No text, no call, not even a denial. Because what could he say? The receipts were there. The tuition payments, the apartment I covered, the events I supported while standing outside the frame. Then came the ripple effect. His company issued a vague statement about internal values and employee conduct. Sponsors started pulling out. One even tagged the article directly in their announcement. It was surreal watching the carefully crafted image he'd built begin to fracture, all from a truth he never thought I had the power to share. I wasn't looking for revenge, not really. What I wanted, what I needed, was recognition. Not from the world, but from myself. And watching the truth ripple through his perfect little ecosystem, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Seen. No more shrinking. No more swallowing my voice to protect his reputation. He got to rise on my back, and now he was falling because of what he chose to forget. HR reached out to him within 48 hours. I know because his assistant, who once pretended I was just the girlfriend, leaked it anonymously. They launched a full review. Quietly, discreetly. But there's nothing quiet about an executive being investigated for professional misconduct rooted in personal betrayal. Suddenly, the golden boy wasn't so golden anymore. And I didn't gloat. I didn't post. I didn't even show up in the comments. I just watched. Because this wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. He wanted the world to believe he built himself from nothing, but I was that nothing. And now, piece by piece, the world was starting to understand what that really meant. His downfall didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about reputations. They unravel slowly, thread by thread, until one day you look down and realize you're exposed. He tried to play it cool at first. Smiled through interviews, dodged questions, but I could see it in his eyes, that flicker of panic when control starts slipping through your fingers and there's no script to save you. More brands pulled out. A major speaking engagement was postponed indefinitely. Internal emails leaked. Someone even found an old photo of me at one of his early fundraisers and reposted it with the caption, "She was always there. He just chose not to see her." That one went viral. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of us who were left behind in someone else's success story. I watched the man who once said I wasn't on their level get buried under the truth he tried to bury me with. And still, I didn't celebrate. I just sat quietly, tea in hand, as the world turned toward the woman he thought no one would ever care to notice. He didn't get fired, not officially. But they encouraged him to step down to preserve the company's image, and he did. Quietly, humiliated, no farewell post, no glowing send-off. Just gone. The woman from the party? She vanished just as fast. No loyalty, no promises. She knew what he looked like at his peak, but she wasn't sticking around for the fall. That role had already been filled. By me. For years. Offers started rolling in. A publisher reached out about a book deal. Conference organizers invited me to speak. "Tell your story," they said. "Be the voice for the ones who stayed, sacrificed, and were still left behind." At first, I hesitated. I wasn't a writer. I wasn't a speaker. But then I remembered I wasn't a wife either, at least not to the man he became. I was just someone who knew how to endure. And now, I was done enduring. So I said yes. Not for the fame, not for the claps, but for the women sitting in the same silence I sat in. For the ones still cooking dinner for someone who forgot what they gave up to keep him fed. I'd been quiet for too long, and now the mic was mine. The first time I stood on that stage, I wore the same earrings I'd once pawned for his certification exam. They'd been tucked away in a drawer for years, forgotten, like I had been. But that night, under bright lights, I put them back on, a small reminder of what I gave, and what I reclaimed. As I looked out at the crowd, mostly women, mostly tired, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just telling a story, I was unearthing a collective truth. I talked about the invisible work, the support, the sacrifice, the late nights, the lies we tell ourselves to keep holding on. And when I said, "We carry them through nothing, and they leave us for everything," the whole room went still. Not because they were shocked, but because they understood. Every nod, every tear-filled eye told me I wasn't alone. I never had been. I'd just been taught to suffer quietly. And when the talk was over, and people lined up to thank me, not just for the story, but for saying what they couldn't yet say out loud, I knew this wasn't the end of my journey. It was the beginning of something bigger. I wasn't standing beside someone else's success anymore. I was finally standing in my own. It was months later when his name popped up on my phone. I almost didn't open the message, but curiosity, old and familiar, pulled me in. "I miss the version of me when I was with you," he wrote. For a second, I stared at those words like they might come with an apology. But they didn't. They never do. It wasn't about what he did to me. It was about what he missed about himself. I took a breath and typed back slowly, carefully. "So do I. But she'll never come back for the man who let her starve for applause." Then I hit send, locked my phone, and went back to my tea. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just felt done. Like the last page had finally turned, and I didn't need to flip back to remember how far I'd come. He used to tell me I was the quiet in his storm, but he never realized I was the one holding the roof in place. And now? I walk with no weight on my back, no shadows behind me, no need to be small. I stood beside him in the dark for years. But now I walk in my own spotlight,